So in the winter of 1920, there was this researcher named John Watson, and he conducted this experiment that, well, it's pretty infamous now.
Right, the little Albert experiment.
Yeah.
Ethically, you could never, ever do this today.
No, absolutely not. I mean, he took an 11-month-old baby little Albert and put him in a room with a white rat.
And at first, the baby was completely fine.
Yeah, exactly. He was perfectly content. He actually reached out to pet the rat. He had, zero biological fear of it.
None at all.
But the moment his fingers touched the fur, Watson was standing right behind the baby's head, and he violently struck a suspended steel bar with a heavy hammer.
Just a massive, deafening sound.
Right, and in a fraction of a second, that noise triggers this ancient survival circuit. The baby just falls forward, buries his face in the mattress, and starts sobbing.
Which is a completely natural biological response to that kind of stimulus.
But Watson didn't stop. He repeated it, so it was like, reach, strike, sob, reach, strike, sob. And within a matter of days, Watson had permanently altered this child's brain chemistry.
He fundamentally rewired it.
Yeah. The neutral white rat had become this object of just sheer, unadulterated terror. And, well, we're starting today's deep dive into the sources with this rather brutal piece of psychological history because it perfectly sets up our mission today.
It really does. It shows how incredibly fast our nervous system learns to be afraid.
Exactly. We're looking at a massive stack of clinical data, neurobiological research, and behavioral psychology to basically completely deconstruct the machinery of fear.
Because there is this massive, profound disconnect between how science actually understands fear and how our modern culture treats it.
Yeah, and that cultural treatment is exactly what we need to unpack first. Because, I mean, you and I and everyone listening, we live in this era dominated by a multi-billion-dollar motivational industry.
So the positive thinking industry.
Right, and it has aggressively branded fear as a character flaw, like it's a disease to be cured. We literally buy T-shirts that say, no fear.
Which is biologically absurd.
It is. We download these audiobooks promising to eradicate hesitation through just sheer willpower. We treat this incredibly ancient, finely tuned survival mechanism as if it were a glitch in our software.
Like it's deliberately trying to ruin your pitch meeting or your date.
Exactly. But the irony is, the motivational industry's war on fear is completely backward.
It is. Because fear did not evolve to make your life difficult. And it definitely did not evolve to be eradicated.
Right.
It evolved for one singular purpose, which is keeping organisms alive in environments where violent death was a daily, highly probable event. We're dealing with arguably the most primitive, foundational emotional system in the mammalian brain.
My favorite way to look at this, and I think about this all the time, is through a mechanical lens. Like if you're driving down the highway and your car's check engine light starts flashing bright red, you don't reach into the glove box, grab a hammer, and smash the dashboard.
I mean, you shouldn't.
Right. You assume the car is communicating something vital about the engine. But when we feel that visceral physical sensation of fear, we immediately grab the hammer. We try to destroy the signal.
You try to suppress it entirely.
Yeah. But to stop fighting it, we have to actually understand what is happening under the hood. So physically, biologically, what is the state of fear?
So from a purely biological standpoint, fear is a highly coordinated defensive motivational state. It's an all-hands-on-deck mobilization. Your psychology, your physiology, your behavior, everything pivots to respond to a perceived immediate threat.
But wait, before we get into the mechanics of that, we really need to distinguish fear from anxiety, because everyday language just mashes them together.
Oh, constantly. People use them entirely interchangeably.
Someone will say, I have a fear of the economy crashing next year. Or they'll say, I'm anxious because there's a huge, vicious dog growling at me right now.
Right. But biologically, those are two distinctly different operational modes. Fear is the response to an immediate, present, tangible threat. The dog is in the room with you. The danger is happening right now.
And anxiety.
Anxiety is a state of future-oriented apprehension. It's the cognitive process of worrying about potential threats that haven't actually materialized yet. It's wondering if a dog might be in the park when you go for a run tomorrow.
Okay, so they share some neurological real estate, but fear is the immediate blaring alarm bell.
Exactly. And when that specific alarm rings, it initiates 3 massive systemic changes in your body, all at the exact same time.
Okay, so the first component is the physiological one, and this is the one everybody knows, right? The classic fight-or-flight response.
Yes, your brain floods the system with adrenaline and cortisol. Your heart rate violently spikes.
But looking at the research, what I find so fascinating isn't just the heart racing, it's what the body actively chooses to shut down.
Because it's all about resource allocation. The human body only has a finite amount of metabolic energy. So in a survival emergency, your autonomic nervous system performs a rapid triage. It decides that long-term projects are completely non-essential. For example, digestion is highly energy-intensive.
But if you're about to be eaten, digesting your breakfast doesn't matter.
Exactly. So the body violently constricts the blood vessels around your digestive tract.
Which perfectly explains why we get sudden nausea,
Yeah.
or the butterflies, or that terrible feeling that your stomach just completely dropped out.
Your body is literally turning the power off in that department.
Wow.
Furthermore, blood flow is aggressively redirected toward your major muscle groups. Your quadriceps, your hamstrings, your biceps. It's preparing them for explosive action.
And it affects your immune system too, right?
Yes, your immune system is temporarily suppressed. Reproductive functions halt. Even your visual system alters. Your pupils dilate rapidly to flood the retina with light.
Trying to capture as much visual data about the threat as possible, that is intense. But it's paired with this second component, the cognitive shift, which honestly I think is the most disruptive part in modern life. The sources describe it as a severe narrowing of attention.
Yes, your cognitive architecture literally reorganizes itself. You develop profound tunnel vision, both visually and mentally. You lock onto the threat. And simultaneously, the brain dampens activity in the areas responsible for complex, abstract reasoning.
Because analyzing the deeper philosophical motivations of a tiger will get you killed.
Exactly. The brain shifts entirely to threat-relevant memory and binary associations. Is this safe or dangerous? Do I run or fight?
Which brings us to the third component, the behavioral response. We always hear fight or flight, but there's a third option that trips everyone up today, the freeze response.
Yes, freezing is perhaps the most misunderstood element of our survival circuitry. In modern contexts, we view it as a failure of courage.
Like it's a sign of weakness.
Right. But in the ancestral environment, freezing is a masterclass in survival. Many predators possess motion-sensitive visual systems. If an organism becomes perfectly rigidly still, it effectively becomes invisible against the background.
The biological imperative is screaming, don't move a muscle, don't draw the eye, and you will live.
Exactly.
Okay, I totally understand the evolutionary logic if there's a saber-toothed tiger scanning the savannah, but I struggle with this when we pull it into our current reality. If this fear system is such a finely tuned protector, why does it feel like a catastrophic glitch in modern life?
What do you mean?
Well, let's say you're sitting in a corporate board meeting, you're asked a complex question, and you just go completely blank. You freeze, your heart is pounding, you can't find your words, you look terrified. That isn't keeping you safe, it's actively harming your career.
That sensation of glitch stems entirely from an evolutionary mismatch. We are walking around the neurological threat detection system designed for Pleistocene predators, but we're deploying it in a world of PowerPoint presentations and performance reviews.
Right.
The brain processes the threat of social evaluation, being judged by your peers, with the exact same physiological intensity as physical danger. But, the real problem isn't the initial freeze itself.
It's how we react to it. Because we fight it. We realize we're freezing and we start panicking about the panic.
Precisely. When you freeze in that meeting, your conscious brain realizes this is socially inappropriate.
Right.
You start internally screaming at yourself. You demand that the fear stop.
But the amygdala, the threat center, it doesn't speak English.
No, it only monitors your internal physiological state. So when you fight the fear, you create massive internal conflict and distress. The amygdala registers this distress and concludes, oh, the danger is even worse than I thought.
So it pumps out even more cortisol, which just deepens the freeze.
Yes.
Going back to the car dashboard analogy, it's like I'm smashing the check engine light, and the car's computer says, the driver is violently attacking the cabin. Things are critical. Flash the light twice as hard.
That's a perfect analogy. The antidote to that specific escalation is just recognizing the fear for what it actually is. An outdated protective mechanism.
Acknowledging it without resisting it.
Right. Because when you understand that your body is genuinely, if misguidedly, trying to save your life, you can stop fighting the signal. That prevents the secondary surge of panic, allowing the system to naturally downregulate just enough for you to speak.
But the speed at which this happens is just terrifying. I mean, I can be perfectly calm, and a fraction of a second later, I am in full fight or flight. To understand that instantaneous switch, we have to look at the literal architecture of the brain. We have to look at the amygdala.
Yes, the amygdala. It's this almond-shaped cluster of nuclei deep within the medial temporal lobe. It is the brain's primary threat detection center.
And for decades, scientists knew it was involved in fear, But it was the neurobiological research by Joseph Ledoux at NYU that really mapped exactly how information reaches it.
Ledoux's work is groundbreaking. It completely changes how you view your own reactions. He discovered that sensory data doesn't just take one path into the brain. It takes two distinct routes.
The low road and the high road. Let's look at the low road first, because the math on this is staggering.
The low road is a direct, hyper-fast neural pathway from the sensory thalamus, which is the brain's relay station, straight to the amygdala. And the defining feature of the low road is that it completely bypasses the sensory cortex.
So it skips the thinking, conscious part of the brain entirely.
It skips the processing chip completely. It transmits a very crude, low-resolution, blurry representation of what you're seeing or hearing. But because it doesn't travel through the complex circuitry of the cortex, it is blindingly fast.
How fast?
A visual stimulus traveling low road can trigger a physiological fear response in the amygdala in approximately 12 milliseconds.
12 milliseconds. I looked this up for context. A standard human blink takes about 300 milliseconds. So this alarm is ringing almost 30 times faster than you can close your eyes. It is literally happening before conscious thought is physically possible.
Yes, the amygdala is launching the cortisol and adrenaline before your cortex has even had the time to assemble the visual data to tell you what you are actually looking at.
My analogy for the low road is a cheap, hypersensitive smoke detector in a small apartment. You know, the kind that goes off screaming at 120 decibels just because you left a piece of toast in the toaster slightly too long.
Very familiar with those.
Right. It's incredibly fast and it guarantees you won't sleep through a house fire. But it is fundamentally dumb. It has absolutely no ability to distinguish between a raging inferno and slightly overdone sourdough.
Exactly. And that low road is the biological mechanism behind the startle response. It explains why you jump out of your skin when a door slams, before you even realize it was just the wind.
Or why someone with a severe phobia of snakes will physically jump back from a coiled garden hose on the lawn.
Yes, their heart is hammering, because the amygdala processed a crude, curved shape, matched it to a threat template, and fired the alarm.
Okay, so the low road makes us jump away from the garden hose. But eventually we do realize it's just a hose, right? We calm down. That has to be where the high road comes in.
Correct. While the low road is firing, that exact same sensory information is simultaneously sent along the high road. This route travels up into the sensory cortex and the hippocampus.
And what happens there?
Here, the brain performs a highly accurate, high-resolution analysis. It compares the image to past memories, analyzes the context, and determines exactly what the object is.
But all that processing takes time.
It takes roughly twice as long, sometimes up to 30 or 40 milliseconds, or even longer, for complex cognitive appraisals. And in evolutionary terms, that delay is a massive vulnerability.
Let's talk about the evolutionary math here because it perfectly explains why our brains are built this way. Why wouldn't evolution just build one really fast, really smart system? Why have the dumb alarm at all?
It comes down to calculating the cost of errors. In the wild, an organism faces two types of errors when detecting threats: a false positive or a false negative.
Okay, a false positive is like sprinting away in terror from what turns out to be a harmless shadow.
Right, and the biological cost of that error is incredibly low. You burned a few calories, your heart raced for a minute, and perhaps you looked a little foolish to the rest of the tribe.
But you're still alive to eat dinner.
Exactly. A false negative, however, is failing to run away from a shadow that turns out to be an ambush predator. The cost of that error is ultimate. It's death.
Wow.
So natural selection relentlessly favors the hair trigger mechanism, an organism that waits for the high road to fully render a high-definition image of a predator before initiating an escape response. Well, that organism gets removed from the gene pool.
So we are literally the descendants of the early humans who jumped at shadows, because the ones who stopped to analyze the shadow got eaten. Okay, so the low road fires, we jump back from the garden hose. A fraction of a second later, the high road completes its analysis and realizes it's just green plastic. What physical mechanism actually stops the panic? Who sends the all-clear message?
That critical inhibitory function belongs to the prefrontal cortex, specifically a region known as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC. You can conceptualize the VMPFC as the brain's braking system.
The brakes.
Yes. Once the sensory cortex determines the stimulus is harmless, the VMPFC sends an inhibitory signal down to the amygdala. It essentially says, stand down, the high road has confirmed it is just a hose. Cease cortisol production.
But here is a massive point of friction for anyone listening. If we have this highly evolved, rational braking system, Why does it fail so often? Let's say it's 3:00 a.m. You're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and your heart is pounding because you're terrified about a presentation you have to give in the morning. Logically, your high road and your prefrontal cortex know you are perfectly safe in bed, but the brakes refuse to engage. The fear just loops.
Why? The failure of the braking system at 3:00 a.m. perfectly highlights the metabolic limitations of neurobiology. The prefrontal cortex's regulatory power over the amygdala is not absolute. It requires immense metabolic energy to maintain inhibitory control.
Okay.
And that braking system is profoundly vulnerable to physiological states, specifically stress, emotional depletion, and sleep deprivation.
Wait, so when you are exhausted, the brakes literally wear out?
Physically, yes.
Right.
Synaptic fatigue sets in. If you've been under chronic stress all day, or if you're running on 4 hours of sleep, the VMPFC physically weakens in its capacity to suppress the amygdala.
The signals just become too faint.
Exactly. This is why a problem that feels like a minor annoyance at 10 a.m. after a full night's sleep feels like a catastrophic, life-ending threat at 3:00 a.m. The amygdala is firing at the exact same baseline, but the brakes have completely eroded.
I mean, understanding that mechanical relationship completely changes how you view your own anxiety. It isn't a moral failing, it is a literal metabolic deficit.
It's just biology.
But this brings us to a crucial pivot in our deep dive. We understand the biological hardware. We understand the hair trigger. But humans aren't born with a 12-millisecond low-road fear of public speaking or elevators or, like, the French language. How do we develop paralyzing fears of things that pose absolutely zero biological threat?
This is where we transition from evolutionary hardware to learned software. We have to look at fear conditioning and fear extinction, how the brain learns to be afraid of a neutral object and the exact process required to unlearn it.
Let's break down fear conditioning. The foundational definition in the sources is that a completely neutral stimulus becomes associated with a threatening stimulus through temporal pairing, meaning they happen at the exact same time.
Right.
The classic example is Pavlov ringing a bell right before feeding his dogs until they drool just at the sound. But John Watson's little Albert experiment, which we discussed at the very beginning, that is the human equivalent of this wiring process.
Yes. Little Albert demonstrated how rapidly temporal pairing creates a neural bridge. The white rat was the conditioned stimulus, initially neutral. The striking of the steel bar was the unconditioned stimulus. It naturally produces a fear response.
By presenting the rat and immediately creating that terrifying noise, Watson forced the baby's brain to wire the two events together.
Hebbian learning. The neurons that fire together wire together.
The amygdala physically altered its synaptic connections.
It began to treat the visual input of the white rat as a predictor of the impending loud noise. Once that bridge was built, the rat alone triggered the entire fear cascade. And what neuroscience has confirmed since 1920 is that this conditioning doesn't require hundreds of repetitions.
Really?
No. If the unconditioned stimulus is traumatic enough, fear conditioning can occur in a single trial. A single severe car accident, accompanied by the specific smell of burning rubber and a specific song playing on the radio, can instantly wire the brain to trigger a panic attack whenever that song plays.
The brain is basically trying to protect you by saying, the last time we heard this song, we almost died. Run.
Exactly.
So that explains how the software gets installed. But how do we uninstall it? The sources point heavily to a process called fear extinction. But looking closely at the mechanisms of extinction reveals this massive misconception that I think sets up countless people for failure when they go to therapy.
Yes, this misconception is arguably the most important clinical insight in the study of fear. Fear extinction is the process of reducing the conditioned fear response by repeatedly exposing the individual to the feared stimulus without the traumatic event occurring.
So you expose someone to the song from the car crash over and over while they sit safely in a living room, and eventually the panic subsides.
Correct.
But the common assumption here is that we have deleted the fear. I think of it like computer storage. You have a file named fear of dogs or fear of public speaking. You go to therapy, you do the work, you drag the file to the trash bin, and you empty it. The fear is gone. But the neurobiology says that is completely false.
It is completely false. The biological reality is that the original fear memory is never deleted. The synaptic connections formed in the amygdala during the initial conditioning remain permanently encoded.
So extinction does not erase the old file.
No. Instead, it creates a completely new, competing memory file, a file that says, this stimulus is safe.
Ah, so it's active suppression. You are saving a new file over the old one, but the old file is still hidden deep in the system architecture.
It is an active, neurologically demanding process of inhibition. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex utilizes the new safety memory to actively suppress the original fear memory in the amygdala. You literally have two competing neural pathways fighting for dominance. The old "this is dangerous" pathway and the new "this is safe" pathway.
This hidden file reality explains so many incredibly frustrating experiences, like why fears just come back out of nowhere.
It explains three distinct clinical phenomena: spontaneous recovery, reinstatement, and renewal. Spontaneous recovery occurs when the passage of time weakens the prefrontal cortex's access to the new safety memory. You might conquer your fear of flying, avoid airplanes for 5 years, and the next time you board, the terror is back.
The old file just reasserted itself.
Exactly. Then there's reinstatement. That happens when you experience a single re-exposure to an aversive event. You extinguish a fear of dogs, but years later, a dog barks aggressively at you and the entire original phobia floods back instantly.
And renewal.
Renewal occurs because safety memories are highly context-dependent. If you undergo therapy and extinguish your fear of spiders while sitting in a calm, sterile clinical office, the safety memory is neurologically tied to that specific room.
Oh, wow.
So the moment you encounter a spider in your own dark basement, the fear returns. The brain says, "We learned spiders are safe in the clinic, but we have no safety data for the basement. Revert to the original fear."
I want to push back on what this means for traditional psychology, because this really challenges the foundation of how many people approach self-improvement. Millions of people spend years sitting on couches in talk therapy, dissecting their childhoods, trying to find the exact moment they became afraid of failure or rejection. But if extinction is a physical process of building a competing safety memory, does cognitive insight actually do anything? Does knowing why you are afraid help you stop being afraid?
The data strongly suggests that cognitive insight alone, just understanding the historical origin of your fear, is rarely, if ever, sufficient to extinguish a conditioned fear response.
You can't just think your way out of it.
No, because the amygdala doesn't care about your insights. The amygdala is not a rational structure. It is an experiential structure. It doesn't respond to logic or narrative. It only responds to lived experience.
So what do you have to do?
To build that competing safety memory, you must undergo actual behavioral exposure. You have to physically engage with the feared stimulus and survive it to convince the amygdala to rewire.
Okay, so if the system can learn fear in a single traumatic moment, and if the old files are never truly deleted, what happens when this entire architecture starts misfiring on a massive scale? When the threat detection system generates these intense responses to things that pose absolutely no danger, and the person just can't build that safety memory.
When the system loses its calibration, we move from evolutionary survival mechanisms into the realm of clinical anxiety disorders. The underlying mechanism is inappropriate fear activation.
The low road is screaming, "Tiger," when the visual cortex is looking at a household bug.
Yes, this hyperreactivity underlies specific phobias, PTSD, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety.
And the statistics regarding specific phobias are staggering. We're talking about intense, paralyzing fears of specific objects or situations, heights, needles, and closed spaces. The clinical data indicates that specific phobias affect between 7 to 9% of the global population at any given time.
It is one of the most common mental health conditions in existence.
Hundreds of millions of people. But the true tragedy of that statistic is what the sources call the treatment gap. Because specific phobias are not an incurable life sentence. They are highly treatable, right?
They are arguably the most treatable of all psychological conditions.
Yeah.
Through targeted, guided exposure therapy, which we now understand as the systematic construction of new safety memories, the vast majority of cases see clinically significant, life-altering improvement.
And the timeline is incredibly short. For many specific phobias, profound change occurs in as few as 1 to 5 clinical sessions.
Yes.
Let me just stop you there, because I want that to sink in for you listening.
Right.
1 to 5 sessions, a matter of hours.
Because the brain is highly plastic when the fear system is actively engaged. When a clinician safely triggers the phobic response and guides the patient through it without the catastrophic outcome occurring, the brain rapidly writes the new safety file.
But if the cure is literally 5 hours of therapy away, why do millions of people choose to suffer for decades? People will refuse to go into their basements for 20 years. They rearrange their entire existence around a microscopic threat rather than making an appointment. Why?
It represents a massive failure in mental health literacy. People chronically underestimate the severity of specific phobias because they view them as quirks rather than clinical conditions. They think, well, it's just a fear of spiders. I'm not severely depressed. I shouldn't burden the medical system.
But the insidious nature of fear is avoidance. Avoidance shrinks your world.
Exactly. And it isn't just spiders or heights. The data shows that social anxiety disorder is even more prevalent, affecting approximately 12% of the population over their lifetime.
And social anxiety is much harder to just avoid than a spider in the basement because other humans are everywhere. The core definition of social anxiety disorder is a profound, debilitating fear of negative evaluation by others. It is the terror of being judged or found lacking.
And the mechanism is identical. The amygdala registers the potential for social rejection as a profound, life-threatening danger. From an evolutionary perspective, being negatively evaluated and exiled from the tribe meant certain death by starvation or predation.
So the brain has conserved that circuitry.
Yes. And for our listeners who are likely pushing their boundaries professionally or personally, this fear of negative evaluation manifests in hyperspecific, paralyzing ways.
A perfect example, which we will dig into deeply later, is the vulnerability of operating in a second language.
Oh, it is the ultimate storm of social evaluation. You are an intelligent adult, you have complex thoughts, but because you are navigating a new linguistic structure, you are reduced to speaking like a toddler.
And the fear of making a grammatical error, of hesitating, triggers the exact same physiological alarm as standing on the edge of a cliff.
The tunnel vision kicks in, your heart races, you literally forget the vocabulary words you studied the night before, and you freeze. And because the feeling is so intensely aversive, the learner engages in the primary behavioral response to fear.
They avoid native speakers entirely.
Yes, trapping themselves in a state of permanent linguistic stagnation.
Okay, so if our biological default is to avoid the threat, and if eliminating the fear entirely isn't an option because those old files are permanent, how do people who intentionally face terrifying situations every single day actually function? How does a firefighter willingly walk into a burning building?
To answer that, we have to fundamentally redefine what it means to be brave. We have to examine the actual neurobiology of courage.
Because the cultural myth is that the firefighter simply doesn't feel the fear, right? We assume they have ice in their veins.
We assume their amygdala just doesn't fire. But the neuroscience proves that it's a complete fiction. True courage is absolutely not the absence of fear. A silent amygdala is a sign of brain damage, not bravery.
Wow.
In genuinely threatening situations, the physiological alarm system in a first responder is blaring just as loudly as it would in anyone else.
Their low road is flooding their system with adrenaline.
Yes. The divergence happens in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Courage is a neurologically active process. It is the ability of the prefrontal cortex to process the blaring fear signal and override the behavioral urge to flee.
It's the capacity to say, the alarm is ringing, the danger is real, and I am going to execute the mission anyway.
Exactly. The research on high-risk individuals, extreme athletes, military special operators, is fascinating. When they map their cognitive responses, these individuals don't report feeling less physical arousal. They have a fundamentally different cognitive interpretation of that arousal.
Interpretation is the key.
Yes. Through rigorous training, they have rewritten their cognitive software. When their heart races and their palms sweat, they do not interpret those sensations as a stop sign. They interpret those exact same physiological signals as vital data and physical energization. They think, my body is preparing me for peak performance. I am ready.
Let me try a different analogy here. I used to think of it like a roller coaster, but let's look at it like a massive electrical power surge in a house. Fear is a sudden, uncontrollable surge of high-voltage electricity flooding into your internal grid.
Okay, I like this.
If you aren't prepared for it, that surge blows out the circuitry, sparks a fire, and you shut down. You freeze. But a highly trained individual recognizes the power surge coming, and instead of letting it blow the circuits, they plug in a heavy-duty piece of machinery to harness that raw voltage. They use the energy to run the machine.
That is a highly accurate mechanical metaphor. The voltage, the adrenaline, the cortisol is identical in both scenarios. The difference is whether the energy causes a system failure or fuels an action. And there's compelling research on how everyday people can harness this.
Alison Wood Brooks at Harvard Business School, right?
Yes, she conducted a series of studies on how people manage pre-performance anxiety.
The anxiety reappraisal studies. What does she actually do?
She placed subjects in highly stressful evaluative situations, impromptu public speaking, high-stakes math tests, singing karaoke in front of strangers. These situations reliably trigger massive autonomic arousal. She then gave them different instructions on how to handle the feeling. Some were told to try to calm down. Others were told to say out loud, I am excited.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this because if I'm standing backstage, my knees are knocking together, I am sweating through my shirt, and my vision is tunneling, and you tell me the scientific solution is to just shout, I am excited!
Well, that sounds exactly like the toxic delusional positive thinking we were mocking at the beginning of this deep dive. How is that scientifically different from just lying to myself?
It is different because of an arousal congruency. Anxiety and excitement are both high arousal physiological states.
Hmm.
In both states, your heart races, your sympathetic nervous system is highly active, and your body is mobilized. Calmness, however, is a low arousal state.
Ugh. So trying to be calm is the actual lie. Yes. Telling yourself, I am calm, when your amygdala is pumping cortisol at maximum volume, is biologically impossible. It's like slamming your foot on the gas pedal and the brake pedal simultaneously. The engine just revs and grinds. Your brain knows you are lying, which creates more internal distress.
But saying I am excited works because it validates the high arousal state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are not denying the voltage surge. You are simply relabeling its purpose.
You are telling the prefrontal cortex, yes, the heart is racing, but it's not because we are about to die. It's because we are about to do something we deeply care about.
Brooks found that the individuals who reframed the arousal as excitement didn't actually lower their heart rates. They still had the same physiological metrics of stress, but their performance significantly improved across the board. They were rated as more persuasive speakers, they scored higher on the math tests, and they sang better.
They plug the power surge into the machine.
Yeah.
That is incredibly empowering. It means the physical sensation of fear isn't a barrier to performance. It can actually be the fuel. But transitioning here, reframing fear requires a conscious cognitive shift. And it is incredibly difficult to cognitively reframe a fear when society itself has deliberately conditioned you to be terrified of something from the moment you were born. We have to address the contagion of fear.
The social transmission of fear. Because if we only look at biology and direct individual trauma, we miss the vast majority of what modern humans are actually afraid of. Our deepest phobias are frequently constructed and transmitted by our culture.
The foundational research on this is just mind-blowing. Susan Mineca's studies with rhesus monkeys explain the setup because the implications are huge.
Minika wanted to understand if fear could be learned purely through observation, without any direct threat to the individual. She took lab-reared rhesus monkeys. These monkeys had lived their entire lives in a controlled environment. They had never seen a predator, and crucially, they had never seen a snake.
They possess zero innate biological fear of snakes.
None. If you put a plastic snake in their cage, they would happily reach right over the snake to grab a piece of food. They were completely indifferent to it. Then Minika introduced the observational variable. She took these fearless lab monkeys and had them watch a wild-reared monkey, a monkey that had grown up in the jungle, encounter a snake.
And the wild monkey obviously panics.
The wild monkey exhibits a severe, visible panic response. It recoils, screeches, and displays extreme distress. The lab monkey simply sits there and watches this happen. It is never in danger. The snake never approaches it.
And what happens to the lab monkey's brain?
Just by observing the panic of another member of its species, the observer monkey instantly developed a profound, lasting, and paralyzing fear of snakes. In subsequent tests, that lab monkey would refuse to reach over a plastic snake for food, displaying the exact same panic response it had witnessed.
Watching another monkey panic was enough to permanently write the fear file into their own amygdala. The mechanism there must involve mirror neurons, right? The brain simulates the experience of the other monkey to learn a survival lesson without having to risk getting bitten.
Exactly. It is a highly efficient evolutionary shortcut. Learning through direct experience is dangerous. Observational fear conditioning allows a species to transmit survival data instantly across the social group, but it doesn't stop at observation. In humans, we have an even more potent transmission mechanism: verbal threat information.
Verbal threat information, meaning someone just tells you something is dangerous.
Yes, because humans possess complex language, you do not even need to see someone panic. You simply need to be told, repeatedly and with authority, that a stimulus is a threat. A parent constantly warning a child about strangers, a news anchor detailing the horrific dangers of a new technology. Over time, that verbal information constructs a cognitive fear template that the amygdala adopts as real.
So if observational fear and verbal threat information are that powerful, does that mean our modern media environment is essentially operating as a mass fear conditioning machine?
It is an unavoidable conclusion. Our informational environments, cable news, social media algorithms, peer networks are relentless delivery systems for verbal threat information and observational panic. Think about the cultural fears surrounding emerging technologies, economic collapse, or specific political or social groups.
People develop intense physiological fear responses to things they have literally never encountered in the real world. They just watch a screen, see other people panicking, hear their verbal warnings, and their nervous system wires it in.
And this is the crucial reality the sources emphasize. Socially constructed fears are not fake. They are not just intellectual opinions. Once the amygdala adopts the threat template through social transmission, the biological response is identical to the fear of a physical predator. The heart races just as fast. The cortisol floods the system just as intensely.
Even though the fear was installed by a cultural software update rather than physical survival. But the silver lining to that reality is that if a fear is learned through an informational environment, it can be unlearned by intentionally modifying that environment and your behavior. Which brings us to the most practical part of this deep dive. We are constantly absorbing learned fears. What are the proven, clinically validated mechanisms to actually undo them and regain our agency?
The clinical evidence for treating fear and anxiety is incredibly robust. We have 4 highly effective evidence-based treatments that attack fear from different angles. And the first one is the undisputed gold standard, exposure therapy.
We touched on this earlier when we talked about extinction and saving the new file, but let's look at how it physically works in practice, because I think people imagine exposure therapy is just staring at a spider until you pass out.
It is much more systematic than that.
Yeah.
Exposure therapy involves guided, incremental confrontation with the feared stimulus. But the current dominant framework for how it rewires the brain is called inhibitory learning theory.
Explain inhibitory learning theory, because this is where the mechanism of the new file actually happens.
For decades, therapists operated on a habituation model. The idea was to expose the patient to the fear until they got bored, until the anxiety naturally dropped and they felt calm. But inhibitory learning theory, championed by researchers like Michelle Kraske, argues that calming down is not the goal. The goal is to deliberately and intensely trigger the alarm and then violate the brain's expectancies.
Violate expectancies, meaning you have to prove the amygdala's prediction wrong.
Precisely. The amygdala makes a specific prediction. If I touch this dog, it will bite me and I will die. To write a strong new safety memory, you must fully activate that prediction. You touch the dog, your heart rate spikes to 160 beats per minute. You are terrified, but you stay engaged with the dog and the bite never happens. The catastrophe does not occur.
The mismatch between the prediction of disaster and the reality of safety is what carves the new neural pathway.
Yes. The brain experiences a massive prediction error. The prefrontal cortex registers this error and rapidly encodes a new memory. The alarm was fully activated, but we survived. That is how inhibitory learning suppresses the old fear.
Okay, method number 2. Cognitive restructuring. How does rewriting our thoughts actually affect the biological alarm?
Cognitive restructuring targets the cognitive narrowing we discussed in Section 1. When fear hits, the brain defaults to catastrophizing, assuming the absolute worst possible outcome and overestimating the probability of that outcome. Cognitive restructuring is the active practice of auditing those thoughts using the prefrontal cortex.
So instead of thinking, if I stumble over my words in this presentation, I will be fired, my reputation will be ruined, and I'll end up destitute, you force the high road to actually calculate the odds.
You demand evidence. You ask, has anyone ever actually been fired purely for a minor stutter in a slide deck? By forcing the brain to engage in rational statistical analysis, you are actively exercising the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You are increasing the blood flow and metabolic activity in the braking system, which strengthens its ability to inhibit the amygdala.
Method number 3 is a paradigm shift. Acceptance-based approaches, specifically acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. My understanding of the ACT model is, is acceptance therapy basically saying, yes, I am absolutely terrified right now, my amygdala is screaming, my hands are shaking, and that is perfectly fine, I'm going to do the thing anyway?
That is exactly what it is saying, and it is a profoundly effective strategy. ACT completely abandons the goal of reducing the fear. It recognizes that fighting the check engine light only makes it flash harder. Instead, it seeks to change your relationship with the fear.
It links directly back to the biology of courage.
Yes. ACT decouples the internal feeling of fear from the external behavior of avoidance. It trains you to observe the physiological arousal without judgment. You say, my heart is racing, my throat is tight. These are just physical sensations. They are uncomfortable, but they are not dangerous. I'm allowed to be afraid while I deliver this pitch. By increasing your willingness to experience the discomfort, you stop the exhausting cycle of avoidance. The fear comes along for the ride, but it no longer drives the car.
Which naturally deflates the secondary panic. And the final method, number 4, which is deeply biological but often overlooked as a psychological tool, is exercise.
Exercise is vastly underappreciated in anxiety treatment. People assume it just releases endorphins to make you feel good. But the actual mechanism is much deeper. Regular, rigorous cardiovascular exercise physically alters the baseline reactivity of the nervous system. First, it improves sleep architecture, which we know directly restores the prefrontal cortex's braking capacity.
But it also acts as a physical simulation, right? I view high-intensity exercise as a literal fire drill for your autonomic nervous system.
That is a perfect description. Think about the physiological state of a panic attack. Rapid heart rate, hyperventilation, profuse sweating. Now think about the physiological state of sprinting on a treadmill or doing a heavy circuit workout. The metrics are nearly identical.
But the context is completely different.
Exactly. When you push your body in a workout, you are intentionally triggering the physiological symptoms of panic, but you are doing it in a safe, controlled context. You are teaching your brain to tolerate high autonomic activation. You undergo the stress, and then you practice recovery. You are repeatedly proving to your amygdala that a racing heart and shortness of breath do not equal impending doom. Over time, this raises your threshold for anxiety. Your alarm system becomes less sensitive because it is used to handling the voltage.
So we have the mechanical tools. We understand extinction and inhibitory learning. We know how to use arousal congruency to reframe fear as excitement. We understand the decoupling power of acceptance and the autonomic fire drills of exercise. I want to spend the final portion of our deep dive applying every single one of these concepts to one incredibly common, universally terrifying scenario that we anchored early on: the vulnerability of learning a new language.
The adult language learning environment is the ultimate crucible for everything we have discussed, because it perfectly combines the fear of the unknown with the profound threat of social evaluation. It produces a specific cluster of anxieties that directly, measurably impair a person's ability to acquire the skill.
The sources cite the foundational work of Elaine Horowitz at the University of Texas. She developed the foreign language classroom anxiety scale to map exactly why smart adults suddenly freeze up. She identified 3 massive hurdles: communication apprehension, fear of negative evaluation, and test anxiety.
Let's focus on communication apprehension and the fear of negative evaluation, because they're deeply intertwined. Communication apprehension is the profound dread of real-time oral interaction. It is the fear of spontaneous conversation. And the fear of negative evaluation is the terror that your grammatical errors or poor pronunciation will cause native speakers to judge you as incompetent.
And the biological response to that social threat is catastrophic for learning. Because what does the brain do when faced with a threat? It avoids it.
Yes, the fear generates massive systemic avoidance behavior. The learner goes to great lengths to protect themselves from the physiological discomfort of sounding foolish. So they stick to reading textbooks in the safety of their quiet room. They use translation apps. They practice grammar drills alone.
But in doing so, they avoid the exact contexts, the messy, real-time, unpredictable conversations that are neurologically required to actually improve their fluency.
They stay comfortable, but their progress completely stagnates. They never write the new safety memories because they never expose themselves to the stimulus.
My final analogy for the day: the adult language learner who refuses to speak to native speakers is exactly like a basketball player who desperately wants to play in the NBA, but is absolutely terrified of missing a shot in front of a crowd. So they lock themselves in an empty gym. They practice free throws by themselves for thousands of hours. They feel safe, they feel competent, but they will never, ever become a real basketball player because they refuse to play in an actual game with defenders and chaos. But this raises the ultimate practical question: how does someone force themselves onto the court? When the biological alarm is blaring, how do you step up to a native speaker and initiate a conversation knowing you are going to sound unintelligent?
You apply the exact blueprint we have laid out. First, you abandon the false goal of trying to eliminate the anxiety before you speak. The anxiety will never disappear in isolation because the new safety file hasn't been written.
You have to speak despite the alarm.
You utilize the biology of courage. You decouple the feeling from the action using ACT. You accept that your heart will race and your palms will sweat, and you walk up to the person anyway. You use cognitive reframing. You interpret that racing heart not as a warning to run, but as physical energization. because communicating in this new language is deeply important to you.
You deliberately engage the fear system.
You engage it and you survive it. This is inhibitory learning in action. You initiate the conversation. You inevitably make a grammatical error. You struggle to find a word. The alarm is ringing. But then the expectancy is violated. The native speaker does not mock you. They do not exile you from the tribe. They simply ask for clarification, or they smile and help you find the word.
The catastrophe does not occur.
And in that moment of survival, the prefrontal cortex writes a powerful new memory. Making a mistake in Spanish is not lethal. With repeated exposure, that safety memory strengthens, suppressing the amygdala's response. The fear eventually, inevitably, recedes.
That is the perfect culmination of everything we've covered. Let's trace the massive journey we took today. We started by completely discarding the toxic motivational narrative that fear is a weakness or an enemy. We recognized it as an ancient, highly sophisticated biological survival mechanism designed to redirect our blood flow and focus our attention to keep us alive.
We examined the architecture of the brain, traveling down Joseph Ledoux's 12-millisecond low road to understand why our bodies react before our conscious minds even register the threat. And we looked at how sleep deprivation physically degrades our ventromedial prefrontal cortex, causing our braking system to fail.
We looked at the enduring legacy of little Albert, realizing that conditioning physically rewires synapses. And crucially, we learned that overcoming fear is not deleting an old file. It is the active, metabolic process of building a new safety memory through exposure and inhibitory learning.
We redefined courage, proving that brave individuals still hear the alarm, but use their prefrontal cortex to interpret the power surge as excitement rather than a signal to flee. And we explored how fears are socially contagious, passed through observation and cultural narratives, but ultimately reversible through deliberate action.
And we brought all those tools, exposure, cognitive reframing, acceptance, and the fire drills of exercise, down to the practical reality of doing something deeply vulnerable, like learning to speak a foreign language. So, for you listening right now, you now possess the biological blueprint. The next time you are standing backstage waiting to give a speech, or dialing into a high-stakes meeting, or trying to order a coffee in a completely new language, and you feel that sudden sickening drop in your stomach, the racing pulse, the tunnel vision, do not reach for the hammer. Do not smash the check engine light. Remember what is actually happening. It is not a stop sign. It is just your ancient biology flooding your system with the raw energy required to tackle something you deeply care about.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to mull over. We spent the last hour learning how a single intensely traumatic event can biologically wire our nervous system for fear in just one trial. The brain learns danger instantly to protect us. But what would happen if we attempted to hack that evolutionary software? What if we deliberately designed intensely positive, exhilarating courage trials in our own lives? If we repeatedly prove to our nervous system that stepping into the unknown leads to profound growth and thrill rather than catastrophe, could we intentionally rewire our own biology to instinctively lean into the unknown?